I am a big fan of indie games. While I can't deny that the pure spectacle and graphical fidelity of AAA games can be incredible to behold, and hell, sometimes the game is fun to play too, I feel like I always find myself coming back to indies. For one, I adore how indie games are always willing to try new things. In fact, I'd say that in the modern, capitalistic gaming landscape, indies are almost defined by this idea, the pure and total creative freedom granted to the people who make them. The possibilities are literally endless. Indie devs are free to experiment, mash up inspirations from both within and beyond the gaming space, and even try completely new and novel ideas never seen before. Indie games somehow always manage to surprise, and that's why I love them. Pseudoregalia is one such indie game, and clearly draws from two genre inspirations, from 3D platformers and from Metroidvanias. In retrospect, the combination seems kind of obvious, so much so that I'm surprised I haven't seen it in a game before. Pseudoregalia, if you're not familiar, is a retro-inspired 3D platformer released for PC on July 28, 2023, for the whopping price of $6. Essentially, Pseudoregalia asks, what if Banjo-Kazooie, or Mario 64, adopted a straightforwardly Metroidvania progression style, placing movement-enhancing and area-unlocking power-ups throughout one contiguous world? And in my opinion, Pseudoregalia nails the execution. You play as Sybil, an anthropomorphic goat creature that I'll be putting pants on for the footage in this video. Hey, sorry, I'm just trying to not get demonetized over here, okay? Anyway, the story is kept pretty light. We zoop in through this mirror into this prison-themed area, and all we know is that there's a princess out there somewhere. The game's focus throughout is kept pretty squarely on the moment-to-moment gameplay, and I appreciate that. The game starts out straightforwardly enough, starting you in this pretty linear area. You begin the game with almost nothing in your movement kit. You've got a solid jump, and the ability to grab ledges. It all feels good. I love the bit of squash and stretch on the jump, and the ledge grab feels very reliable. The game also implements what's known as a coyote jump, or coyote time, where the game will still allow you to jump for a small bit after walking off of a ledge. There's just a lot of small, quality-of-life things like this that make the game feel extra smooth. One thing I find really interesting is that you have some movement capabilities that aren't explained directly to the player. Crouching, then hitting jump allows you to pull off this incredible backflip into high jump combo, allowing you to reach a little higher than your normal jump. In addition, another move you start with is this Mario 64 inspired side flip, which also gets you to about the same height. What I adore about these two moves is that they are purely optional. At no point in the game, to my knowledge, are you ever required or expected to use these abilities. Now, discerning viewers may ask, why does this game give you two abilities and not expect you to use them? What's the point? And that's fair, it seems sort of counterintuitive. But it introduces what I feel becomes a massive part of Pseudoregalia's identity: sequence breaking. Okay, it's hardly really sequence breaking at this point in the game, but still. If you're attentive and find that you have these abilities, the game will immediately reward you with alternative, faster routes and the ability to skip some sections of this linear area altogether. I'll gush about it some more later, but I adore this. Being secretly given these tools and then being able to experiment with them and see what's possible and what's not is a lot of fun. When I'm given an obvious correct path to follow, I love poking and prodding at the edges of that boundary to find unexpected solutions, intended or not by the dev. It really scratches an itch in my brain. Pseudoregalia makes the perfect first impression on me by basically giving me a fire poker and saying, hey, poke and prod away and see what you can find. Early on, you also find the Dream Breaker, which lets you attack. Combat is inoffensive and pretty straightforward in the game, and for the most part you can just walk past a lot of encounters. I will say though, the fact that attacking doesn't stop you from moving at full speed is great. Also in the tutorial area is the first movement power-up, the slide. It lets you slide underneath objects, but more importantly, it gives you a nice boost of speed, something we'll be seeing a lot more of in Pseudoregalia. Actually, speaking of speed, in my first playthrough, pretty soon after finding the slide, I made a huge discovery. When you slide off a ledge, you maintain your slide momentum through the air. And more importantly, this momentum could be maintained through bunny hopping. Did I mention there was bunny hopping in this game? And it feels good too, with just enough allowance for input buffering to allow for some easy, clean jumping through these levels. So, with this discovery, every single elevated ledge suddenly gets promoted to Speed Booster, giving you speed that you're allowed to keep as far as your own sick bunny hopping can carry you. I just adore this as a creative and quick way to navigate the map. And similarly to the backflip and side flip, this is never spelled out to the user. and if you think to try it for the first time, you're rewarded with an entirely new movement option to use at every single ledge in the game. It's just so good. Anyway, after that, you wander your way into Castle Sansa, and the game map truly opens up, with access to many different areas becoming available, and the game map at this point really looking like a totally interconnected spiderweb. You're free to enjoy this area in any which way you want, which for me was wandering through to another new area, Sansa Keep, and finding another new movement power-up, the Sunsetter, which allows for a ground pound that can be followed up by a super high jump, even higher than the backflip or side flip. This allows access to even more previously unreachable areas. And now I have to gush again, because that's not all the power-up gives you. If you start the ground pound and then hit jump in midair, you'll do this little backflip move out of the air. This tiny little backflip move follows in the footsteps of the side flip and the backflip jump, in that it's not required to beat the game, but if used cleverly, can give you access to tons of places and routes you're, quote, not supposed to be able to get to. It's a sequence-breaking machine, and it knows it. I couldn't count on two hands the number of times I used this move to just barely make it across a pit or up a wall. It's happened so many times, and every time it leaves me saying, there's no way I was supposed to do that. But what I love about Pseudoregalia is that it doesn't stop you. If you're willing to get creative with your movement, use all of your abilities to their fullest, and take advantage of every movement quirk you've learned, many of the game's seemingly hard item checks turn out to be just doable, if barely. And once you've made it through, and you get that distinct feeling of, ooh, I'm not supposed to be here yet, the question then becomes, how far can I push this? Some of my favorite moments in the game were just me getting completely lost in later areas of the game, woefully underprepared in terms of power-ups, but determined to see where I can manage to get myself. All of the boundaries in Pseudoregalia feel soft, in a sense. There are sparse occasions where you do need specific items to get through, but by and large, it's not so set in stone. A lot of paths can be taken with various combinations of power-ups and techniques. And, I don't know, when you realize the navigation and the routes through the world aren't so rigid as a traditional Metroidvania, it makes every close jump, every path you take, feel distinctly yours. With the game so open-ended, the player really begins to take ownership of the techniques they've learned, and further, take ownership of their own exploration through the world. It feels like you're the one cutting your way through this soft, hole-filled cheese of a world, and by golly, if my only tool is a worn spoon, I'm gonna make it work. Now, I'm just going to briefly go over the other movement power-ups, since I feel like they make up a huge part of this game's identity. The Sun Greaves are this game's wall jump equivalent, and I love how they work. It lets you kick out your leg, and when you hit a wall with it, it kicks you off the wall and mirrors the angle, leading to a completely predictable angle, and also leading to some unique possibilities with it. If, for example, you want to get tons of distance, you can aim for the shallowest angle you can. Or, if you just want to turn yourself around 180 degrees, a perpendicular kick does exactly that. This is one of the best feeling wall kicks I've seen in gaming, and the sound it makes is just immaculate. Ascendant Light lets you bounce off of enemies by hitting them with your weapon. This one's just alright. Enemies aren't that common in the game, so its uses are pretty limited to the areas the devs intended for you to use it. Solar Wind is one of my favorites. It's almost equivalent to the Super Mario 64 long jump. It's a pretty important one as it's one of the easiest ways to cross large gaps. But most importantly, it lets you go fast. And, just like when you slide off of ledges, you can bunny hop to keep the momentum, basically replacing the ledge slide as the de facto best movement option, since you can do this anywhere. This is what makes Solar Wind my favorite move. It just makes navigating the world so much faster. Also, it looks sick. Finally, the last power-up you're likely to find is the Cling Gem. This one's a little janky, but it lets you slide alongside walls up to 10 times before falling back down. This one has some obvious uses, but like some of the other power-ups, you can get extra mileage out of it if you put in the effort. Repeatedly wall clinging and then jumping out of it can get you a bunch of extra height, thus replacing Sunsetter as the best way to reach high up places. I don't really mind this one being kind of OP, since you're likely to find it towards the end of the game anyway, and it's still a bunch of fun to use and exploit to your own whims. At this point, I should talk about how my first playthrough of the game went. One of the first items most people find after the tutorial are the Sun Greaves. They're in the listless library, which is connected to the first real area of the game, Castle Sansa. For reference, this full playthrough I found on YouTube, that took about 2 hours, found them 15 minutes in. But you see, I'm stupid, and walked into the area, saw this seemingly unreachable balcony, completely missed the door you're able to walk through, and then left, thinking I'll come back later when I can reach the balcony. Little did I know that besides the Kling Gem, the Sungreaves would be the last item I get. I think a lot of my experience with this game was impacted by this decision of mine. Everywhere I looked, I saw seemingly impossible tasks, tricky jumps, and areas I felt unprepared for. But, despite that, I carried on, eventually finding the aforementioned Sunsetter, and exploiting the hell out of that move to get me anywhere and everywhere I could get. And hell, I made it through almost the entire game without the very first power-up most people get, one that, for many people, defines the movement of this game. And I had a great time doing it. The feeling of using your entire willpower and squeezing every last drop of potential out of your movement kit to achieve seemingly impossible tasks is a bizarre but wonderful feeling that I can't recall having in any other game. I've only scratched the surface of cool quirks and discoveries about the game's movement. For example, how Solar Wind, the long jump, interacts with other abilities in the game. Solar Wind sort of buffs specific abilities if you use them quickly enough after a Solar Wind. For example, if you wall kick quickly after, you actually get extra height on the wall kick, which opens up some unique possibilities. Similarly, if you do Sunsetter's mini backflip move after Solar Wind, it too gives you extra height. And funnily enough, if you do it fast enough, you're actually able to cram both of these moves into that timing window, letting you perform a pretty cool hyper wall kick backflip combo for some stupid height. And finally, while I was experimenting with Solar Wind, I found the holy grail of hidden techniques, the hyperflip. You see, it took me until the very end of the game to figure this out, but it turns out the height you get on the side flip increases with the more speed you have. And if you're maxed out on speed while doing one, you're rewarded with the highest jump in the game. The easiest way to perform this, which is the way I found it, is to side flip immediately after a Solar Wind. But, as it turns out, you could do this technique from almost the very start of the game using the previously mentioned ledge slide technique. I was so shocked when I discovered this. This move is utterly game-breaking. It's the highest jump in the game, and it alone can get you across basically every gap. And for the game to let you do this as soon as you get the slide is crazy to me. But, like I've been saying, that's a big part of what defines Pseudoregalia's identity to me. It's just like when I use the now pitiful looking backflip move to skip a part of the tutorial area. The game rewards attentive and curious players with powerful moves that players can then use as they wish to dig their way through the game with the moves that they feel ownership of since they're the ones that discovered it. The moveset in Pseudoregalia is like a Swiss Army knife, immensely useful and varied, and you can use it in any which way you want to tear your way through the game. Except in this case, there's like 10 hidden blades packed into the knife, and every other tool has a hidden second function that is arguably more useful than its counterpart. And the game immediately rewards you every time you find a new way to use and take advantage of your Swiss Army knife moveset. This, I think, also just so happens to make Pseudoregalia a great randomizer game. There's a pretty good randomizer for this game by Spud Sandwich that you can find on Nexus Mods, and I'd recommend it if you've gotten the itch to replay Pseudoregalia. Every movement power-up is useful in its own right, so the first item that you find in a run can completely shape how you have to navigate the world. Just like how for my run, finding Sunsetter first meant leaning on it for basically everything, and my navigation of the world being completely shaped by where it specifically could get me. Though I will say, the hyperflip does kind of take the wind out of the rando sails for me. It's just a little too powerful a move to have access to from the start, so personally when I play the rando, I try to make using it a last resort sort of option. But hey, in its own way, it's still fun to absolutely break the game in half by using it, so your mileage may vary. I've got to talk about this game's aesthetic now, since it's one of my favorite parts about it. I grew up on N64 games, stuff like Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and even Glover. This game absolutely attempts to mimic this aesthetic, and in my opinion, it completely nails it. The retro PSX aesthetic has been very popular in the indie space for a while now, with games such as PSX Bloodborne, Lunacid, or even Ultrakill to some extent. But I feel like the N64 aesthetic, by comparison, doesn't get as much love. It lacks the jagged edges and lack of anti-aliasing the PS1 was known for, but makes up for it with other unique aspects. The N64 is largely defined by its comparatively simplistic texturing, and even geometry at some points. The combination of basic geometry with muddy, blurred textures give many N64 games a sort of toy-like or dream-like quality. It's hard to explain. You'll see N64 games all the time opt for blocky and abstract environments instead of going for realism. Just think of the Bowser levels from Super Mario 64. It kind of feels like these games only make the vaguest attempt at mimicking reality, leading to the style that these games adopt being almost enforced by the hardware it's on. And now, when you combine it all together, the blocky, toy-like geometry, the blurry textures making objects sort of melt into each other, It all lends itself to making N64 environments feel unmistakably dreamlike. Like, just look at the hub world from Glover and tell me it doesn't feel like a dream. Pseudoregalia leans hard into this identity, mimicking basically everything I just described to a T. The textures are blurry, the geometry is very blocky, and the fog is lingering just how I remember it from my childhood. Dare I say, the vibes are immaculate. Pseudoregalia absolutely passes the vibe check with flying colors, and that's also thanks, in part, to the soundtrack created for the game by Potato Tetto. I've been playing it throughout the video, but it captures that same ethereal and dreamy vibe I've been describing perfectly, and is just generally super relaxing to listen to. It really just lets you melt into the game world and enter that chill, zen state. I love it. So, that's my take on Pseudoregalia. If you haven't played it already, I highly recommend it. It's honestly in contention for my Game of the Year 2023. It's just such a refreshingly unique take on two of my favorite genres out there, 3D platformers and Metroidvanias. It actually felt like it was made for me. I just love this game. It really feels like an indie miracle where the stars aligned and an amalgam of different inspirations all came together to make a completely unique experience. Thanks for watching.